So we have here the pelvis anatomy tutorial by the Health and Medicine. This is a YouTube video that I found, and I suppose it's highly beneficial because it shows the ligaments of the pelvis in 3D. We will stop and organize it generally from time to time, but let's delve into it. Generally, if you think about it, if you think about the ligaments, generally it's good to think about the ligaments that are around the joints and the rest of them. Yes, if you really want, you can even divide them. If you those that are not around the joints, about those ligaments that are near the foramens, for example, because we have a lot of foramens in case of the pelvis. Yes. But let's start with this video, and from time to time I will stop to add something.
Talk about the ligaments of the pelvic today. To start, I'd like to start with the hip joint. As you can see, we got a bunch of ligaments surrounding the hip joint. The first one that you need to know is the iliofemoral ligament, which is this guy here. As you recall,
of course, generally, we'll more concentrate about those ligaments later when we talk about the hip joint, but still it's in the video and you need to know it sooner or later, so listen to it also.
The structure above it, this structure here was the ilium, so this structure here is connected to the femur, which is the iliofemoral ligament. And of course, same reasoning, this is the pubofemoral ligament. And if you look at the posterior view, we're going to see that ischiofemoral ligament, because if you recall, this was the ischium. Now, again, ilio, pubo, and ischium. There's this ligament here, which is called as iliopectineal bursa.
Okay, this is not a ligament. This is a bursa. This is something different. Bursa are not ligaments. Bursas are the structures that are reducing the friction. Yes?
We actually got a couple of bursas surrounding the pelvis. We'll talk about them. So I will take those structures out. Iliofemoral ligament, the one we just talked about. As you can see, there's just another structure underneath that, and this is known as the articular capsule of the hip joint. And as you can see, it's kind of surrounding the hip joint like a capsule. So it's very easy to memorize. So articular capsule of the hip joint. And underneath that, we got another ligament, which is known as the synovial membrane of the hip.
One more time. The synovial membrane is not a ligament. Synovial membrane is just the internal part of the articular capsule that it produces the synovial fluid, as you already know.
Hip joint. And this is the last one. Synovial membrane of the hip joint. And there is one last one, this one that surrounds the acetabulum, and this is known as the acetabular labrum.
Acetabular labrum obviously is also not a ligament. It's a cartilage. It's a bit similar to the shoulder, so it will deepen the hip joint generally. Still, of course, the guy that is explaining this is not explaining it the best, but he has some nice software that I do not have, so we'll still use this video.
Put it back all together, so you can see there are almost 3 layers. If you recall, this was the iliopectineal bursa. There are 2 more on the trochanters. If you remember, this was this top portion of the this guy here is the greater trochanter, and the one below it is the lesser trochanter. This ligament on top, this one here, is known as the deep trochanteric.
One more time, this is not a ligament, this is a bursa.
Bursa, and the one below it is the superficial trochanteric bursa. And that's pretty much it for the hip joint itself. Now looking at the pelvis itself, you'll see that there's this ligament here, which is known as the pubic symphysis. And
one more time. Of course, pubic symphysis is not a ligament. However, above and below the pubic symphysis, we have the superior and inferior pubic ligaments, yes, that are not visible here, but generally that would join the pubic bones superior and inferior to the pubic symphysis.
If you recall, this was the pubis. And there are two more structures here, and this is known as the inguinal ligament, which connects the ilium to.
So inguinal ligaments, yes, these are the ligaments, obviously. Okay, that's
Pubis. Okay, so now we can talk about these ligaments here. This big one here, looking directly at you, is the longitudinal ligament, and this goes all the way up to the spine. I'll talk about that later in my future tutorials, but you can see it's going up. This is the lumbar part of the longitudinal ligament, and this is the sacral part of the longitudinal ligament. Now, speaking of spine, if you recall, these big spines here, the last five, are known as the lumbar spines, and which makes sense why to even be called this ligament here iliolumbar ligament, which is connected to the lumbar.
Yeah, so iliolumbar ligament, as you can see, is connecting the lumbar spine with the ilium.
Or vertebra. And then we got the anterior sacroiliac ligament, which is this guy here. It's connecting the sacrum to the ilium, so it's known as the anterior.
Okay, and of course it is covering the sacroiliac joint, yes?
Sacroiliac ligament. Well, if there's anterior, of course, there's a posterior as well, which is this guy here, is known as the posterior sacroiliac ligament. There is if you recall, this structure here was the spine. We used to call that a spine. So guess what? This structure here is known as this sacrospinous ligament. Sacrospinous ligament. And
to be more precise, it's ischiadic spine, yes? So because this is this bone is ischium.
If you recall, this structure here was the ischial tuberosity, so which is why we call this ligament here sacrotuberous ligament. So again,
for now he is right.
iliolumbar ligament, anterior sacroiliac ligament. We got the sacrospinous ligament and sacrotuberous ligament, which connects to the tuberosity, and this one connects to the spine. I think that's pretty much it for the front. Now we're gonna focus on these two small ones. These are the coccygeal ligaments. This is the anterior sacrococcygeal ligament. Connects the sacrum to coccyx. So this is known as this anterior sacrococcygeal ligament, and this is the lateral coccygeal ligament. It's makes sense because it's away from the center of the body. So we said anterior, guess what? There's a posterior sacrococcygeal ligament. Now we can talk about the other ones. This one is known as the interspinous ligament, and this ligament goes all the way up. Again, I'll talk about that in future tutorials. If you see, this is the interspinous ligament, the lumbar part, and you're just focusing on the sacral part, which is this one here. This one. Interspinous ligament. And, there's another ligament on top of the interspinous ligament, which is known as the supraspinous ligament. Supraspinous ligament. There's another structure here, which is known as the ischiogluteal bursa. And I think the last structure that we need to focus
Of course, one more time. Bursa is not a ligament.
On is this one, which is known as the Interosseous sacroiliac ligament. And I think that's it. That's pretty much all the ligaments for.
Generally, the interosseous Sacroiliac ligament is the strongest from the three. So as you remember, we have the anterior, posterior, and interosseous sacroiliac ligaments. And okay, I suppose he mentioned the most important one. Of course there are more, as you mentioned in your answers. But here, he really got through the most important ones that are the most important to the anatomy of it. We also have some, as you can see, between the ischiatic bone and the pubic bone, you have the membranous obturatorium. Maybe it's not exactly the ligament, but a membrane. Still, it's made from connective tissue. If you, so this is this at the bottom, yes, just to the side of the pubic symphysis, between the pubic symphysis and the trochanter, yes. In the between this, we have this membrana obturatoria, and membrana obturatoria is also important because it keeps the organs in place. Yes. Obviously, if you think about all of those ligaments, why do we have so many of them? It's because a lot of mass is put on this area of the body. Yes. Our abdomen, chest, upper limbs, head, neck, all of it. Yes. All of it is pushes down. All of the organs from the abdomen and pelvis is pushes down. So the pelvis needs to keep all of this mass. So the area of the pelvis is also the most frequent area of the hernias because of it. So those ligaments has two functions: to keep all of the joints stable and to keep all of the organs stable. Yes? That's why we have a lot of the ligaments that are not connected to the joints, but are connected to some holes, let's say, to some breaks in the pelvis. Yes. So, for example, membrana obturatoria is covering this hole. Yes. The sacrotuberous and sacrospinal ligament is also covering the holes behind. Yes. So when we would connect all of those ligaments and muscles there, it will all create the scaffold for keeping all of the organs in place. Yes. So this is the second function of those ligaments that is not very common in the rest of the organism. Yes. Of course, it is everywhere to some extent, but here is the most important. Yes, because the mass is pushing most down. Yes, so the pressure of the organs here in the pelvis is the highest one. That's why those ligaments that are keeping the organs in place needs to be the strongest. Okay, thank you very much.